What is ethnic studies? In light of recent events in the community, we've decided to address some public concerns regarding the implementation of ethnic studies and ethnic literature courses in the Poway Unified School District. First, let's start off with defining ethnic studies. Northern Arizona University defines ethnic studies as the interdisciplinary study of race and ethnicity as understood through the perspectives of major underrepresented racial groups in the United States. The four foundational disciplines of ethnic studies are African American Studies, Asian American Studies, Chicano-Latino Studies, and Native American and Indigenous Studies. The PUSD Ethnic Studies course will focus on these four disciplines and also examine other racialized groups in America.
Now it's time to address some of the criticism that ethnic studies has received. Ethnic studies is teaching students to believe America is a racist country. As stated in the definition, the goal of ethnic studies is to provide new perspectives on history by examining impacts of race and ethnicity in society, as well as examining the history of various ethnic groups. Through ethnic studies, students are exposed to historical implications of American institutions, which have led to various disparities we see across racial and ethnic groups today. It is no secret that America has had a history of imposing policies and practices which have targeted and harmed communities of color, and it is imperative that we as a society not only address what has happened in the past, but understand how discriminatory institutions still persist today in various ways, whether implicit or explicit. In studying ethnic studies, students can gain a cross-cultural understanding of America and appreciate the diversity while simultaneously recognizing the racial disparities that still exist. Studying real historical events and applying them to present-day society promotes critical thinking and should not be seen as indoctrination. It is simply education.
Ethnic studies makes white students feel guilty about their race. Let's be very clear. The implementation of ethnic studies is not meant to make white students feel guilty about their race. As mentioned before, ethnic studies examines various racial and ethnic groups while taking into account the historical practices that have harmed and continue to harm these groups. The root of these discriminatory practices is white supremacy. White supremacy is defined by Merriam-Webster as the social, economic, and political systems that collectively enable white people to maintain power over people of other races. Learning about white supremacy is not meant to villainize white students. It is simply a reality that must be addressed. Understanding the structural and socioeconomic power that white Americans have held for hundreds of years gives context to today's racial inequity, which ultimately allows us to work towards solutions.
Ethnic studies is preferential treatment based on race. In the typical U.S. K-12 curriculum, history and social science courses rarely teach about the history of minoritized racial and ethnic groups in America. A study by the National Museum of African American History and Culture found that generally only 1 to 2 lessons, or 8 to 9% of total class time, is devoted to Black history in U.S. history classrooms. In another study by Professor Christine Sleeter, she reviewed California's history and social studies framework and found that of the nearly 100 Americans recommended to be studied, 77% were white, 18% were African American, 14% were Native American, 1% were Latino, and none were Asian American. It is clear that history classes fail to cover accurate and substantial content related to various ethnic groups. If they do, they are usually limited and oftentimes portray groups in stereotypical ways. Not only that, but dialogue on these groups is often given from a Eurocentric perspective, which fails to accurately represent them. In literature, stories are often told from the viewpoint of white authors, even when they deal with topics like racism that directly affect minorities. Other narratives that aren't centered on racism rarely feature diverse authors or characters, and this lack of representation in literature is harmful to students. Ethnic literature aims to provide that representation and expose students to a wide variety of societal perspectives. The existence of ethnic studies in ethnic literature is not preferential treatment towards students of color, but rather a means to finally recognize the cultural relevance of these groups in history and today in society.
Examining everything through the lens of race is not the solution. Though people claim that nowadays everything has to be about race, it would be dishonest to ignore the real implications that race has on the way people are treated in society. 17% of Native Americans, 25% of Asian Americans, 31% of Latinos, and 45% of African Americans report experiencing discrimination when trying to rent or buy housing. Black, American Indian, and Alaska Native women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy complications. Black students are 3 times more likely than white students to be suspended than white students for similar infractions. Black, Latino, and Native American students attended schools with higher concentrations of first-year teachers with less experience than white students. Only 31% of Black Americans and 22% of Hispanic and Latino Americans are employed in management and professional occupations. These are just a few out of hundreds of statistics which point out current racial disparities in America across several sectors. The school-to-prison pipeline, mass incarceration, health inequity, and voter suppression are just a few examples of institutions which continue to marginalize communities of color. So when people say, we make everything about race, there are specific policies that we can point to that have caused this inequity across multiple aspects of life. By addressing these inequities, we can work towards a solution.
Ethnic studies harms Black and brown students and ruins self-esteem and performance. Studies have shown that ethnic studies benefit students. A 2016 Stanford study on the academic benefits of ethnic studies courses found that among at-risk youth, attendance for those encouraged to enroll in the ethnic studies increased by 21 percentage points, GPA by 1.4 grade points, and credits earned by 23. The study also found significant effects on GPA specific to math and science. Grade point grew in English language arts as well. Experts say the courses also promote social-emotional learning and help students and communities to recognize and celebrate their diversity. They're about pride and dignity, mutual respect and understanding, and collaboration across cultures.
Black, Asian, Latino, Native American, and other ethnic communities deserve to have their history accurately represented in schools just like white students have. Remember, the lack of representation for various racial groups in school curriculum has led to this need for an elective such as ethnic studies, whereas Eurocentric history has always been the standard and core curriculum of U.S. history.